Hi everyone, I'm Maureen Wiley. I'm a professor of composition and I study learning science for fun. And I'm here to talk today about how to take great notes during lectures. In today's video, we're going to talk about how to overcome the anxiety and overwhelm of taking good notes and some strategies you can use the next time you find yourself in a lecture. Before the lecture begins, it can be useful to check in with your mindset. A lot of students believe that it's important to copy down every single thing that the professor says, or to copy into their notes everything that's written on the lecture slides. Usually what that causes is a lot of anxiety and overwhelm, and students who feel like the professor is moving through the material too quickly. When you enter into a lecture and you're trying to copy down every single thing that the professor says, your brain is going to start scanning for the most relevant information. Oftentimes this means that our brains sort of go offline and they're just looking for things that might actually be on the upcoming exam or any kind of test, which means we're not actually really learning, and it makes it hard to pay attention to the examples that the professor is giving. This often leads to a feeling of high anxiety and overwhelm, which actually diminishes our brain's capacity to learn. So the first tip I have for you today is don't obsess about getting every single thing down that the professor is saying or everything that you can see written on the lecture slides. That's actually not the point of lectures, and I'm also going to show you some strategies to fill in the gaps of information in case there is something that you missed that you wish that you had been able to write down, but the professor was just moving too quickly. Before the lecture, there's a couple of things you can do to help set yourself off on the right foot. The first one is a tip that I call front loading. This is where you take a look at the information that is expected to be on the lecture ahead of time, either by reading the chapters that'll be assigned in a textbook or taking a look at something like a course overview if it's provided from your professor. If you've been given a reading assignment for the week, try to read the chapter ahead of class. It's important to recognize that you don't need to retain every piece of information from the chapter. It's actually more useful to get what's called a bird's eye view, or to read the chapter, basically familiarizing yourself with the ideas that might end up showing up in the lecture. This is going to prime your brain to pay better attention during the lecture because you'll have identified a couple of the key ideas, the key concepts, or even some vocabulary terms that you want to have defined for you during the lecture. When you're reading over the chapter, look for key concepts and write them down on a separate sheet of paper, perhaps one that you might later use during your note-taking in the lecture. And if possible, come up with a couple of questions that you'd like to have answered or you expect to have answered when you're listening to the lecture that is forthcoming. The reason for this is that brains are prediction-making machines. Brains love to seek for information and to resolve questions of uncertainty. So if when you're reading the chapter, you make some predictions about what kinds of things you're going to learn about in the upcoming lecture, or even just looking at the lecture title, you make a prediction of what you're going to learn about, your brain is going to be like a heat-seeking missile for that information. It's also going to help you to stay focused during the lecture, particularly if the professor gets off track, which we are sometimes known to do. Another strategy for reducing anxiety and the feeling of overwhelm when taking lecture notes is to leave gaps periodically in your notes. For example, if the professor moves on too quickly from one slide to another, or if the topics change, leave a few lines in your lecture notes to go back and fill in later. This is the perfect opportunity to go back and fill them in when there's a question asking period during the lecture, or if not, when you're reading over the textbook or doing any homework assignments for the course, you can fill in the gaps of information in your lecture notes and also help to solidify the information that you learned during the lecture. On occasion, students don't make the connection between what's happening in the lectures and what they're learning about in the rest of the course. So another tip is to make a connection between the material that's being covered in the lecture and other things that you've read, done, or studied in that same course. For example, if you had a discussion, you had some readings in a textbook or in another reading assignment, or perhaps you had a test or an exam or a project, how are these ideas in that lecture connected with those topics? Many times lectures build upon each other, starting off with the foundational concepts in a course, and then later building off of those foundational concepts. So whether you're at the beginning of the semester, the middle of the semester, or the end of the semester, it's useful to pay attention to how are these ideas connected to one another, because there's usually some thought process behind the connection between the various lectures and topics in a course. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever got about taking lecture notes is to let go of any kind of perfectionism around having clean, neat, organized notes during lectures. That is not the time for that kind of thing that you might see on Instagram or on a bullet journal. Lecture notes can be messy, and in fact, one of the next strategies I'm going to introduce to you is very free form, very creative, and it allows for a lot of artistic expression. And that is the idea of taking notes through creating a mind map. You might be familiar with this idea, but a mind map is a way to cluster ideas together and draw connections between the various ideas. You can start in the center with a circle that has the topic of the lecture in the center, and then all the various subtopics that are covered during the lecture can be drawn in bubbles in the surrounding area or in circles in the surrounding area, and then later you can draw connections between those ideas. If your professor is someone like me who likes to give a lot of examples during a lecture, you can also include larger bubbles on the outskirts of the piece of paper or wherever you're taking your lecture notes that are illustrative examples of ideas. And that can actually be pretty useful for later on when you're doing any kind of papers or research or other types of assignments. You can go back to your mind map, and it can be a great place for idea generation as well. The mind map is also a great thing for people who like to draw during lectures. A lot of my students like to illustrate or create diagrams, and the mind map lends itself well to those things. You can also use color coding later, but I recommend that after the lecture is over. It's a little bit too distracting to try to do all those kinds of things during the lecture as it's happening. One of my favorite approaches to taking lecture notes is something that I call purpose-driven notes. And this is where you decide ahead of time your main purpose while the lecture is taking place. For example, you might be looking for certain signposts, like if your professor uses terms like this is important or this relates to, and then they mention another idea from the class. Like I said before, a lot of lectures tend to build on foundational concepts. So if you can draw those connections, you have a purpose in your lecture notes. You have something that your brain is actively seeking more information about, which again is going to help you to stay focused. You also might create a purpose in your lecture notes, such as learning 3 key skills by the end of that day's lecture, or taking 3 practical applications of that topic and how it would be, how it would express itself in the real world, for example. And then finally, one of my favorite ways to approach this, and I often tell my students, is look for 3 examples of what not to do. And this can be a really great question to ask if your professor is the type who asks if there are any questions. You can talk about what is the wrong way to approach this topic, or what is a not to do kind of thing. Now, I teach writing classes, so I find it really fun to explain to students, here's what not to do when it comes to essay writing. And if you're interested in those kinds of tips, you can stay tuned. Another approach that uses our brain's natural focusing ability is something called conversational note-taking. And this is where you're focused less so on the individual examples, but more so on the larger context, almost like you're having a conversation between the topic, the material, the professor, and your own brain. So an example of conversation note-taking would be to ask questions in the actual lecture notes and then see if those questions are answered over the course of the lecture. And it also includes a sort of back and forth where you can make connections to your own personal life or other things that you learned about perhaps in another class. For example, a student in one of my composition classes was talking about how they had learned about a similar concept in a sociology class, and drawing those connections between your brain's neural pathways is an excellent way to solidify the information that you're learning. And finally, the best strategy to take great notes is to actually use the notes later. Sometimes students take excellent notes, then they close their notebooks, they leave the lecture hall, and they never look at those notes again. So if you want to be someone who can take great notes and then actually put those notes to good use, take this final tip and run with it. This is called practicing spaced repetition. You might have heard this term before, but spaced repetition refers to reviewing information periodically, often with breaks in between that might include something like taking a nap or sleeping. So let's say you go to a lecture on a Tuesday morning, then you take excellent lecture notes, as you've now learned how to do from watching this video, and then the best thing to do would be to review those notes at a later date, possibly the next day or at most a couple of days later. Reviewing those lecture notes is a perfect opportunity to fill in those gaps that we talked about, to answer any questions that are lingering, to add additional information that you may have learned in the meantime from, for example, reading the assigned chapters in the textbook, or asking questions during a professor's office hours. And then you can periodically review that information to help solidify those new neural pathways in your brain to make sure that that new learning goes directly into your long-term memory. And finally, a bonus tip is to try to teach that information to someone else. So whether you have a study buddy in the class, or you make some friends who want to study together before an exam, or even just somebody in your family or someone nearby, someone you care about, see if they'll let you take a minute out of their day to explain a concept, because not only do we lock in our learning about a topic by having to explain it to someone else, but also gaps in our understanding, anything that we're not totally clear about, that we don't feel totally confident about our grasp of, is going to become abundantly clear when we try to teach it to someone else. So those are my tips for how to take great notes. Thanks for watching.